Hey there everybody, it's me, Paxton, aka P3, and I'm here to I would like to talk about a modern deck. This one's called Lvl Black. It is a deck of my own creation, or I should say I appropriated this deck from 8-Rack, the modern classic. Traditionally, 8-Rack uses the rack, 4 copies, and Shrieking Affliction, 4 copies, in conjunction with discard spells like Inquisition of Kozilek, Smallpox, Liliana of the Veil, Thoughtseize, and Raven's Crime. In tandem with all of these creature destruction spells to clear the board, clear everyone's hand, and then finish the opponent off with the rack spells. Now, this deck takes a slightly different approach. The centerpiece of this deck is the Infernal Tutor, which says reveal a card from your hand and search your library for a card with the same name. Reveal that and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Aha! But if you have Hellbent, which means if you have no cards in hand, instead you search your library for any card, for a card, put that into your hand, then shuffle your library. So if you are using cards like Smallpox and Liliana of the Veil and Raven's Crime and Collective Brutality to gain card advantage while you discard your own hand, as weird as that sounds, I'm going to say it again, you gain card advantage while discarding your own hand. And what that ends up looking like is your opponent has nothing and you have something. You just need to have a little bit of something extra than your opponent so that when they get to nothing, you still have something. And the epitome of creating this effect is the card Smallpox. Each player loses 1 life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, then sacrifices a land for only 2 double black mana. Now, that makes it extremely difficult for cards outside of mono black and or just black X to cast Smallpox, which is pretty much its only restriction. It is extremely efficient for the effect. For only 2 black mana, you get to pressure your opponent's life total, pressure their hand, pressure their creatures, sacrificing lands, pressure their mana. So the best way to take advantage of Smallpox is to have it. Well, there's 2 ways. If you have nothing and they still have something, then when you Smallpox, you bring them closer to nothing, thus evening up the game. That's like a worst case scenario. Best case scenario, you have more somethings than your opponent has somethings, so when you Smallpox, you push them closer to nothing while you still get something. And those somethings manifest in some devious ways, like Mutavault. It is a manland, and it's not a creature, so when you cast Smallpox, you won't have to sacrifice it. And then once your opponent has no creatures, you can turn on your Mutavault and start attacking. Or at least my favorite way to take advantage of the situation that Smallpox creates is by casting a Tombstalker. It's simple, a simple 5/5 with flying. It's like a Gurmag Angler in the air. That's what you get for the 1 extra black mana. A Gurmag Angler costs 7 CMC, 1 black and 6. This Tombstalker cost 7 CMC. And the main plan of this deck is to summon this bad boy game 1 and beat down on the opponent. Hopefully you will have removed all the cards that they have in their hand using your discard spells. You know, we have Inquisition of Kozilek 4, Thoughtseize 3, and we're going to get rid of their ways to stop them from dying to Tombstalker. And to facilitate getting Tombstalker out, we even have a lot of extra spells which we can pitch into our graveyard for like maintaining an even level of card advantage. We have the Mishra's Bauble 4 and a set of fetch lands. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 7 fetch lands, I believe. I usually use a split of different titles for fetch lands, so notice I'm using A Verdant Catacombs, Bloodstained Mire Marsh Flats, and Polluted Delta, all 4 different kinds of fetch lands which can search for swamps. This is important because in today's metagame, your opponents will be playing things like Pithing Needles, and they're going to try and be disgusting and nail down your fetch lands if they have nothing else to name. I mean, let's be honest, they're probably going to try and name Liliana first, but you never know. You don't want to get stuck with 3 Polluted Deltas in your hand and your opponent has a Pithing Needle and Polluted Delta, so we're trying to create an even split. For this deck to be optimized, I would even cut a Polluted Delta and replace it with a Marsh Flats. Just minor picky things. A cool trick that you can use with your fetch lands, especially since we actually don't have any pain lands in this deck, we're always going to be searching for a swamp or a snow-covered swamp when we crack one of our fetch lands. So a good thing to do is to play your Mishra's Bauble before you play any land, especially if this is like a turn 1 scenario where you have a fetch land and Mishra's Bauble in your opening hand. You play the Bauble first and crack it to look at the top card of your own library. That way you know if you want to draw that card or not, and you can play your Polluted Delta and wait to crack it, or you could crack it that turn so you don't draw that card that you saw on top with Mishra's Bauble if it's a bad card. Simple, efficient, gaining card advantage without spending any mana. Speaking of card advantage, we got this guy over here, Dark Confidant. Everyone knows what he does. At the beginning of your upkeep, you reveal the top card of your library, lose life equal to its mana cost, and put it into your hand. Now, I realize it seems pretty insane with Tombstalkers in the same deck as a Dark Confidant, and truthfully, you're going to get hit by the Tombstalker. I goldfish this deck extensively, and the average seems to be 1 in every 16 Dark Confidant reveals is a Tombstalker. And, you know, you're going to get more than 16 Dark Confidant triggers in the course of a long tournament. So this is going to happen where you take the damage. However, in my experience, this deck's life total is almost irrelevant. It gets such a tight grip over the opponent and what they're doing. It controls their hand, it controls their creatures, and your life total just becomes absolutely irrelevant. You can just stop whatever your opponent's doing, and yeah, your life total just really isn't that important in this game. It's certainly not a race, and you even have extra tools like Collective Brutality to help you gain life and run away from an opponent who's doing like an aggro strategy. So if the Tombstalker plan doesn't work, let's say you Smallpox them, you Liliana them, you Inquisition and Thoughtseize, you set up your Raven's Crime, you've been fatal pushing their creatures, you lay down a Tombstalker, you attack, and then, no, they destroy it. You know, whatever it is, Assassin's Trophy, So then we have a plan B, which is to Infernal Tutor up for our Ensnaring Bridge, and play Ensnaring Bridge, and use the racks to kill them over the course of a long game. If especially we have Raven's Crimes and Liliana's set up, then we can eat their hand and kill them with the rack in a long game. And this plan is especially deadly because your opponent won't see this coming. They just won't. I mean, let's say they guess what you're doing with the Smallpoxes and the Lilianas and the Urborgs, and they say, oh, he's playing the rack, okay. And then a Tombstalker comes down and starts to do things, and then your opponent's going to be confused. They don't know what they're playing against. And they just won't know that you have the power to Infernal Tutor up an Ensnaring Bridge out of nowhere. And that can, sometimes, especially game 1, that's just enough to win. Especially when you have these static permanents like the rack to finish off your opponent. This is like especially deadly against a player who's playing like Spirits, or they just don't have a way to interact with these Ensnaring Bridge, the rack permanents, which are really surprising. Like, your opponent will, from turn one, start to play around stuff like Ensnaring Bridge if they see you're playing Grixis Whir, or something like this. Lantern Control, decks that they can expect have Ensnaring Bridge, but the element of surprise is definitely well in this deck's favor. It's, yeah. So what else is going on in this deck? We have a Nihil Spellbomb. This is sort of a meta choice. It used to be a cast down, which destroys target non-legendary creature. I like the Spellbomb right now because Dredge and Izzet Phoenix are running around. There's a lot of really powerful graveyard decks, and this is just great to really get them where it hurts. You can tutor for the Spellbomb, and all is good in the world. Then we have the Fatal Pushes, the Raven's Crimes, the Collective Brutality. Fatal Push, pretty straightforward. It interacts really well with all of our permanents. That sacrifice, like Mishra's Bauble and the fetch lands, it works well with Smallpox, and the Spellbomb even. So you can get the Revolt trigger easy to pick off your opponent's creatures, and especially if your opponent is going for some kind of, like, Elves deck. Like, they go land, creature, pass. You can go Fatal Push, pass, and then they go land, creature, pass, and you go Smallpox, pass. And, you're just gaining so much card advantage over them. Here we have the Collective Brutality, another way to help you discard your hand, which is actually more like hand sculpting for you. Like, for example, we have the 4 Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoths, really help you even up your mana base, and extra Urborgs can be easily discarded with the Smallpox, Lily, Raven's Crime, and Collective Brutality. It just lets you sculpt a hand. It lets you make every single card useful. Every single card will trade effectively with one of your opponent's cards, and or one and a little bit of your opponent's cards. So the modes on Collective Brutality are just versatile. We have 2 in the deck to kind of stabilize things, gaining life for safety. It kills creatures. It can look for instants and sorceries. Black has ways to do each of these effects more efficiently on their own, but the versatility is worth the little bit of extra mana. And yeah, once again, hand sculpting. Trying to get to no cards in hand when you want Infernal Tutor. And Raven's Crime is an incredibly efficient spell in the late game, and it allows all of your lands to turn into discard effects, which will put a lock on your opponent if you have a rack out and start to pressure their life total. And yeah, haven't really mentioned Liliana specifically, but she's fantastic. She is also a lock on the opponent, especially behind an Ensnaring Bridge. If your opponent can't remove her, she will run away with the game very fast. And anyone who's played enough games of Modern has felt the withering clutches of Liliana of the Veil. And so we have 4. Another legendary permanent, which we can sculpt away from our hand if we want to. Sometimes it's better to just have a backup in our hand. Alright, so here we are, the Game 1 main deck for Next Level Black. You gain a lot of free card advantage. You use Infernal Tutor and Tombstalkers to win, or you could set up a lock with Liliana in the rack. You have Mutavaults, Urborgs, Fetchlands. It's a really good Game 1 deck. And I should mention, against any deck that isn't trying to win before turn 4, any deck where speed is not a priority, for example, if you're playing against Control, if you're playing against mid-range, if you're playing against anything that's basically not burn, Any deck that isn't trying to beat you to death on turn 4 or play some nasty combo really fast, you're going to take the draw. So instead of taking the play, you want to say, I choose to draw before the game starts, before you look at your hand. Because just having one extra card in hand, again, when you're playing Smallpox and Liliana's and Collective Brutalities, eventually your opponent's going to have nothing, and you just want to have something, and hopefully that something is a Tombstalker in the air that they won't be able to respond to before it beats them down. Okay, so that is a summary of Game 1 Next Level Black. Let's look at the sideboard. A really good reason to play this deck is what it has to offer in this sideboard, especially in terms of the graveyard tech and anti-creature tech, because that pretty much is the metagame right now. We have like Dredge and Is It Phoenix and Grixis Death Shadow being graveyard decks, and then we have, you know, aggro decks, and we have Tron. But then we also have a lot of creature decks like Spirits and Humans and Elves, and even Goblins and silly things. Hate Bears and Death and Taxes. Oh my gosh. So for these kind of creature decks, I especially like to use the Bitter Blossom, or no, that's not correct. Against any creature deck that isn't flying. Like Spirits, you can't really use Bitter Blossom because they can just block all the tokens. But against humans, you can get a bridge out and play a Bitter Blossom, and that's a really good way to win. With the Ensnaring Bridge out, you just want to have 0 cards in hand at the end of your turn. Make sure you cast a card every turn. But then when you draw a card, you wait to cast it or play it if it's a land, and then you get to attack with your 1/1 creature tokens in the air, since Bridge says creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. So if you have at least 1 card in your hand, then your creatures with 1 power can attack, and that's all of your Bitter Blossom tokens. And they all have flying. So that's a cheap and easy way to put together a victory. For anti-graveyard tech, we have the 4 Ley Lines of the Void. It's hard to know what's the best anti-graveyard spell in the game. I've always leaned on Ley Lines. It's just a really good card. You can just turn winning matches into a simple average of, do you draw the Ley Line in your opening hand or do you not? And to support our lovely Ley Lines, we have Surgicals. This is a slight nombo. Like, if your opponent has no graveyard, then you won't be able to Surgical them. But I mean, if you get the Ley Line of the Void out against the graveyard deck, you're going to win anyways. So, I mean, it's really difficult to lose at that point unless you just draw nothing but more Ley Lines and Surgicals. And I suppose that can definitely happen. But once again, you have all the power with your Smallpoxes, Lilianas, and Collective Brutalities to sculpt your hand. And yeah, Surgical, if your opponent is putting a lot of cards into their graveyard by themselves, it's already incredibly deadly. Sometimes we board in Surgical if your opponent has no plan to put a lot of cards into their graveyard, like Tron. If we Smallpox them and catch one of their Tron lands and Surgical that, then that's probably GG right there. Speaking of Tron, and I suppose Storm, we have a Dampening Sphere. It covers both of those decks quite nicely. As anti-creature tech, we have the 2 Bontu's Last Reckonings. If your opponent loses to the Ensnaring Bridge game 1, which is very likely if they are playing some kind of creature deck, especially Spirits, then games 2 and 3, Bontu's is nasty. They will likely board in things like Night of Autumn to deal with Ensnaring Bridge, and they will lose Efficiency because those are not Spirits. Also, to help us deal with creatures and aggro decks especially, we have the Gifted Aetherborns, and these are just really great because they have lifelink, and they also do pretty good against mid-range decks because they're just a better mid-range card, to be honest. It's 2 mana for a 2/3 Death Touch lifelink, and if that's left to swing a few times Yeah, good stuff. Lastly, I got a shiny Duress. It has beautiful artwork, and you play it against any deck that you can Duress. Simple. Speaking of which, if your opponent is Duressable, then a lot of times you want to start taking the play. You can get Duress in the Surgicals active, and if you take the play, then you're going to try and use your turn 1 discard spells plus Surgical to just gimp the opponent into an early defeat by snagging whatever card they need to win, say Ad Nauseam, or if they're playing Death Shadow, you can snag all their one of creatures, or be creative. That's what this deck encourages. You have to think creatively, you have to think abstractly, consider all of your plays very carefully, and grind out that little bit of card advantage so that when your opponent has nothing and you have something, you win. This has been an introduction to Next Level Black, a deck of my own creation by Paxton, aka P3. Thank you for watching.